My name is Maeve Clark, and I'm the Adult Services Coordinator here at the Iowa City Public Library. Thank you very much for coming to our very first WOW program. And WOW is our rendition of Weber Days for I've gone back in time. For 2014, the whole Archives Alive has taken me back in time. Anyway, let me start over again. Welcome to our first Weber on Wednesday event, or what we're calling WOW. During the month of May, the library celebrates not only National Preservation Month and local history, but our local historian, Irving Weber. And this is appropriate for you, your rhetoric class at the University of Iowa. I'm going to give you a little background on Irving Weber and why you're a part of Weber on Wednesdays. Irving B. Weber lived his entire life and almost the entire 20th century in his beloved Iowa City. His family roots were deep into the beginnings of Iowa City, as his maternal grandparents settled in Iowa City in 1839. His paternal grandparents came to town in 1857. Irving Weber was born at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900. He was educated at Iowa City Public Schools and graduated from the University of Iowa in 1922. He's remembered for many things. He was the University of Iowa's first All-American swimmer. He was the founder of the Quality Check Dairies and served as its president until his retirement in 1966. He was an active member of the Iowa City Host Noon Lions Club and was the local school board president from 1952 to 53. There is a school, Irving B. Weber Elementary, named after him when it was built in 1994. He is, however, most remembered, at least for us here at the Iowa City Public Library and those at the Special Collections and Archives, for his over 800 articles he wrote for the Iowa City Press Citizen beginning in 1973. His view of history was not one of dull retelling of facts and names. He told what it was like to grow up in Iowa City, the best places to buy penny candy, the joys of cooling off in Melrose Lake in the summer, and of sledding parties on the closed-off streets. He recorded for future generations the story of Iowa City, as no one else could. In 1989, in gratitude for his work in recording local history, Irving B. Weber was named Iowa City's official historian. All of the articles Irving Weber wrote for the Iowa City Press Citizen are available online through the University of Iowa Digital Library. Through the cooperation of the Iowa City Host Noon Lions Club, they took Irving B. Weber's articles and made an 8-volume set. This is volume 1 of it. The other 7 volumes have gone somewhere. They're over there, and they're not giveaways, so please take a look at them, but don't take them with you. And after the University of Iowa Archives and Special Collections digitized these, we had a discussion here at the Iowa City Public Library, and Lolly Eggers, who is the former library director, had all of the 800 plus articles that Irving had written. And so one of our staff members, who's here in the audience, Melody, scanned all of the other articles, and they all exist on the Iowa Digital Library under the Irving Weber page. And they're fascinating. They really do give you a lot of flavor of Iowa City. Irving Weber died in 1997, barely missing a century of life. Living true to character, his last days were spent writing history, listening to Iowa basketball games on the radio. So if we've piqued your interest in local history or exploring family history, please take a trip to the second floor of the library. We have many fascinating items in Iowa City and Johnson County, as well as materials on how to research your family's story. And also over on the table, where I think Karen will probably explain more, there's a bookmark that will take you to our digital history website, and we've got something new coming up later this month, so do take a look at that. And also there is a flyer for our other Weber on Wednesday event. So we've got things on Wednesdays, hence Weber on Wednesdays. Wow. And then we have a special program this Saturday that is a history of the College Green Park, which is just up the street on College Street, and that's called From Covered Wagons to Tornadoes. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm not going to talk about Archives Alive because you're going to talk about it. So I'll turn this over to Karen.
Thank you, Maeve. I'm Karen Mason. I'm the curator of the Iowa Women's Archives, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about my favorite subject, the Iowa Women's Archives. I've put up a slide here that I thought was appropriate to the season. Unlike the batter, though, I'm hoping that today we'll hit a home run. Looks like she missed the ball, if she even swung. This is a photograph that's available in our digital library, but also in the Iowa Women's Archives if you want to see the actual live item. I'm pleased that all of you students have had a chance to use the Iowa Women's Archives even without physically setting foot in the door of the archives. And I wanted to give you a little background on the archives so you'd know a little bit more about it. The archives is a research facility that was started in 1992 in order to preserve the history of Iowa women. Sorry. There it is. Sorry, I just wanted to make this interesting. So we were started in 1992 to preserve the history of Iowa women because women in general and Iowa women in particular are usually not part of archives. Archives have generally been the province of great white men, people who held power in society. So we're located on the third floor of the main library, and if you came in the reading room and peeked through the doors to the stacks, you'd see a bunch of gray boxes like this. But within those gray boxes are some wonderful collections that about 1,100 of them that document women from all walks of life. You can see here a basketball program from 1955, a photograph from our Mujeres Latinas project, and a diary from 1945. And these are just among some of the types of materials that the Iowa Women's Archives collects, including photos, diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, publications, scrapbooks, postcards, audiovisual material, and increasingly electronic material. But given that we're committed to preserving the history of people who have often been left out of history, we've had several special projects over the years. An African American women's project, a rural women's project, and most recently the Mujeres Latinas project to make sure that we have those groups that are usually forgotten in history. Where am I? There. So we're the Iowa Women's Archives. We're committed to preserving the history of Iowa women, who we define broadly as women born or educated or who lived some part of their lives in Iowa. But that doesn't mean the Iowa Women's Archives is just about women or just about Iowa, because those of you who are being educated here at Iowa may have come from other states. Many of you will go on to live in other states or even around the world. And so we have material within our Iowa women's collections that have to do with the whole world. And this map just indicates some of the places that our collections represent. So even though there's a great big glob over Iowa, there's a lot of material from other parts of the world. And it just takes a little digging sometimes to find that material. And if you were to come in the Iowa Women's Archives, which I hope you will all do after hearing this scintillating presentation, you would find yourself in the reading room. And here's a couple of photographs from the archives reading room. Janet Weaver, the assistant curator, is in the top slide helping a student use a collection. And down below we have former women's historian Linda Kerber helping out some students in the reading room. All of the material must be used in the reading room because it's unique and irreplaceable. And so that's why it is great that we've recently undertaken some initiatives to make our collections more available to people who can't come into the reading room. And so we have, in the Iowa Digital Library, we have digitized a number of collections relating to Iowa women, including, this is a photo from the YWCA dance team from the greater YWCA of Greater Des Moines, and it's part of our African American Women in Iowa digital collection. But we have also many other digital collections on Latinas, Department of Physical Education for Women, artist Eve Drulo, and many other topics. The woman who wrote the first Nancy Drew novels under the pseudonym Carolyn Keene. Before we have materials digitized, however, we need to make sure that it's okay to digitize them. Are they in good enough condition to be digitized? Because we don't want to irreparably damage them by digitizing them. So they go up to our conservation lab, where the conservation staff will assess the material, stabilize it as needed, and then do the scanning for it, which is one small part of the whole digitization project process, which I won't go into today, but they're a very important part of the digitization process. There we go. So more recently, we've taken on some special projects, and I'm using we, the royal we, to indicate the University of Iowa libraries, because I'm certainly not doing it. I'm just a small part of it all. And so we have something called DIY history, where we have digitized mostly handwritten, but not entirely handwritten material, and had people go in and transcribe the material. So here, for example, is the diary of Cora Schofield from 1881 to 84, which, I don't know if you can read that, where she says, yeah, you probably can, John, October 27th in rhetoric class, was put in 2nd division and felt awfully blue, but begin to think it is the best thing, for I will know it when I am through. And most of those in 1st division have had to study it before. One of the collections that we have that most of you are familiar, well, you're all familiar with if you're in the rhetoric class, because if you didn't read one of the Burke diaries, you certainly heard about it, letters. And here are some pictures of Evelyn Burkeby. On the top is a photo of her in the middle with 2 of other radio homemakers broadcasting over KMA radio station from Shenandoah, Iowa. And down below is a picture of Evelyn just a couple of years ago in the Iowa Women's Archives with her son Jeff Burkeby when she came to be part of the book festival. As I won't talk more about Burkeby because you will be hearing about that from other people. But I just came back from visiting Evelyn, and I wanted to convey some words from her because she is unable to be here today. She is 94, almost 95, and going strong, but she couldn't get here. So she says, greetings to the 2014 University of Iowa rhetoric classes. I might not be able to visit with you again before the end of your class sessions, and wanted to be sure to let you know how much I appreciate what you have done and how interesting it has been for me. What a joy to be part of this remarkable group of young people and exceptional teachers exploring my World War II scrapbook from the Iowa Women's Archives. I thank you for bringing new life to these real people who are writing to me from military training centers, Navy ships, and near battlefields. You delve deeper into the meaning and background of the letters than anyone has ever done before, including me. I have been surprised by how much historical background you found for each one and how many romantic mentions you've read into the letters. In fact, she has another scrapbook that has some Valentines from the people that you studied. The photographs and videos are especially appropriate to fill out the stories of people behind the letters. They were wonderful young men, and not all of them survived the war. You have honored all of them with your interest and care in writing about them. I especially like the paper mentioning my sending a photograph of myself to one of the soldiers, who replied that he had showed it to everyone in his company. Your take on that was that for him to do so, I must have been beautiful. Now, at the age of 94, that observation made my day. Thanks again for taking me into your studies. It has been a delightful journey into the past and a pleasure to have you as new friends brightening my life. Thank you all, Evelyn Burkeby. And I encourage you all to come visit the archives and look at Evelyn's other materials and other things in the archives. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Keegan. This is my colleague Matt Gilchrist. We are faculty members in the Department of Rhetoric, where we also co-direct what is known as Iowa Digital Engagement and Learning, the acronym being IDEAL. And we, in concert with Jen Wolf and Kelly McElroy in the UI libraries, who we're very grateful for their support, devised this project. So we want to talk a little bit, first I'll talk a little bit about what IDEAL is, very briefly, and then talk about the impetus for and design of this project. And then Matt will walk you through the particulars. Before we get started, we want to thank Evelyn Burke for allowing us to kind of use her material. A big thank you to the students for all the hard work. Thank you to Iowa City Public Library for hosting us, and the UI libraries for the continued support they give us and inspiration. So, and thank you to for all of you. This is like a much larger crowd, I think. Our students have to be here, but you guys, you're not all our students, so thank you. IDEAL is partly funded by the University of Iowa's Provost's office, and we were given a grant in the summer of 2012 to work on ostensibly assignment redesign with respect to rhetoric. Rhetoric is the only required course, I think, of all undergraduates at the University of Iowa. And because it's so large, you get a variety of assignments. And one of the things that Matt and I started thinking about was, that's a lot of papers to grade and speeches to grade. Is there a way to make them arguably more engaging for us, and hopefully the students too? Nothing against papers, it's just that papers do a lot of things that other assignments can do equally well. So one of the main charges that the rhetoric department faces is training undergraduates in how to do research beyond Googling something. And so we decided, well, how can we do this and make it meaningful for students? And one of the things that Jen and Kelly brought to our attention was the University of Iowa's library's DIY history project, which you've heard a little bit about. And we piloted this last semester with some Pioneer Lives letters, which are letters from the late 19th, early 20th century from, I would think, mostly Norwegian immigrants to and from home. And then Jen came to us last summer and said, or over the break, and said, "Wait, I've got a great thing here. We got this World War II scrapbook, and there's all these letters." And at the time, I was it was a little suspect. I thought, they're all going to write about. It was only like 6 guys, writing letters. And I want to hear we have 36 students or something, or 40, 50. I don't know. I don't want to hear about the same dude over and over again writing Evelyn these letters. And it actually turned out to be wonderful because it became a layered approach. You saw each student's take on these letters. And so the way we designed the assignment then was to break it into rhetorical analysis, 400 words of rhetorical analysis, 400 words of historical contextualization, where the students would look at the time out of which these letters came. They would compose a screencast detailing some aspect of the letter, and then deliver a live presentation, as well as transcribing the letter, right? That's the initial thing. And the idea here was to show them that research is not finding a fact in support of your argument, which is what it often is understood to be, or finding a web page that describes in detail the thing you want to know. But it's actually more hands-on than that, from the transcription process of kind of excavating the text or these points, and then conveying your argument to a larger audience in a variety of modes. And that is the mission of IDEAL, in large part, is how do you take student learning and bring it into contact with the community, however we understand that sense of community, and how do we make use of the available means of persuasion, if we're talking in rhetorical terms, or the available digital media with which students are so well versed often. And one of the things IDEAL tries to do is take advantage of a skill set that most of our undergraduates, or many of them, already possess as they move into their college careers. And so rarely, in some cases, are those skills being utilized by the assignments they're asked to complete. So that's what IDEAL's kind of mission is, and that was the objective for the project. And I'm going to turn over to Matt, who will kind of walk you through it.
Okay, we want to ground you in some concrete things here before our students come up and present on the projects that they've completed. So I want to give you a quick tour of the IDEAL site. And the project that I'm showing you right now is actually done by Zach Stark, who will be the first student to present today. You can see here that Zach's composed a screencast. He will here narrate his process of discovery with respect to his exploration of this particular document that he's transcribed through DIY history. And as Zach talks about that, you can see that the technological affordances of the software allow him to zoom in on particular words and phrases in this letter that's handwritten. He can then feature things like handwriting that's difficult to read, or as you'll hear him talk about, things that are not words on the page and what they might mean, what the writer might be trying to convey in his rhetoric to Evelyn. The screencast is coupled with, as Tom said, 400 words of historical and rhetorical analysis and some images. The images, unfortunately, are broken on this computer and they're not loading in any of the browsers. But if you do go to Ideal on another machine, I am guessing that they're working today. So this project, the Archives Alive project, has been then used for 2 semesters running now in rhetoric classes. And starting next fall, we will move it out into wider curricular partnerships, in particular with students studying arts. Liz Lerman, a performance artist and choreographer, is coming to campus for a residency through Hancher. And an arts class headed by Claire Baldus will be taking up the Archives Alive project to look at how war correspondence can be turned into art performance. Her students create puppets and do puppet shows. And so the characters for their puppets will be inspired by correspondence through the archives. So first, students transcribe these letters and get hands-on experience through that process. They then dig deeper. And that's, as Tom was saying, a process of research that's not obvious in, for instance, the finished product. But as students explore these things in multiple modes, they do some writing, some presenting, and then this screencast presentation, they come to a really deep understanding of all of the implications. And as Tom suggested, having students share those with one another through the affordances of the web helps them learn from each other's projects. One anecdote that I'd like to share about the learning potential of the web is that as my students drafted these things and shared them with each other, they learned from approaches that every other student had used. And in fact, they learned facts, since many of these students were examining different letters written by the same gentleman to Evelyn. They learned more about the history of those gentlemen from each other, almost, than they did from their own research and exploration. And that set them off on new avenues of inquiry, back into the research to find answers for questions that they hadn't even thought of before they'd been able to view their fellow students' presentations. Without further ado, I want to turn this over to the students and let them feature their own projects. Zach Stark will start. He's one of my students. He'll be followed by 2 of Tom's students, and I'll let Tom introduce them when the time comes. After which, the 6 panelists will all sit and take your questions, okay? So Zach, come on up.
Hey, I'm Zach. As Tom and Matt were telling you, the main goal of this assignment is to analyze some of the rhetorical techniques used in these letters, and more significantly, why they were used. And we're going to take a look at some of the grand historical events that had vast impacts on American society in conjunction with some of the personal relationships developed in these letters. And the reason why I called this letter to a friend is that Takahashi was genuinely friends with Evelyn. And in writing this letter and in expressing some of the intentions that he did tacitly in the letter, he's fully embodying the persona of a friend. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So not romantic, but friendly. And after actually talking to Evelyn, it was confirmed that they didn't actually have any sort of romantic relationship, and they remained friends until the point where Dick Hayashi died. But this letter was written on August 12th, 1943. As you may have seen from the screencast, his writing was very difficult to read, very hard to decipher his words. But looking into the actual style that was used in his writing of the letter, he uses a very informal tone. He uses simple language. He uses a lot of crass colloquialisms. He tells her no fooling. He jokes around a lot. It's just very colloquial. And simple language is the language that is most related to pathos. And of course, he's trying to make a primarily emotional appeal to her, considering that they were friends. He's not trying to convince her of anything or cause her to support some sort of argument. So he also references many American commonplaces. He talks about vacation, how every day feels like a vacation, how he's been seeing Broadway plays while he's stationed at the military base he was stationed at in San Francisco, California. And he does all of this most likely in an attempt to create this state of cognitive ease in her mind and make her feel more secure and safe, considering that they were friends and it would be in his interest to do so. And he's done that for a variety of reasons. Now getting to Pearl Harbor, the first of the larger historical events I'll be talking about. This happened on December 7th, 1941. It was an unprecedented, inexplicable attack on American soil. It was the first one in over 3/4 of a century since the Civil War. There were nearly 2,500 casualties, half that number was injured. And of course, this would have impacted the American psyche because it would have made America as a whole feel less secure, considering that they had been virtually untouched on their own land in over a century prior to the occurrence of this event. And then we're going to get to the next slide. I don't mean this sarcastically. I commend Dick for acting in the way he does. He didn't succumb to this transcendent sense of masculine dominance that seems to be prevalent in our culture and that may have been back then. By researching Dick, the class found out that he was a first-generation Japanese-American citizen, and both of his parents are originally from Japan, so I'm sure that their culture influenced his development. And he feels sympathy for Evelyn, quite obviously, expressed in a very subtle way. So of course he wouldn't try to alarm her. He's not attempting to act cavalier or arrogant. And then considering some of the reasons why he may have been almost cheerful in the writing of this letter was that roughly 20 days prior to the writing of this letter, Benito Mussolini, who was the fascist leader of Italy, was arrested and deposed by his own people, which signaled the exit of one of the three major powers in the Axis allies withdrawing from the war. So it, of course, would have been considered a great victory for America. That would have been a cause for celebration. And then another thing that may have factored into the writing of this letter was the home front. And this is a picture of Rosie the Riveter, who was the symbol of feminine empowerment when females dominated the workforce, when a great deal of the male population was overseas fighting in the wars. And in this total war effort, the government requested strongly that American citizens donate their hair to make equipment like ropes, donate some of their spare clothes. From the years of 1943 to 1944, there were no automobiles built because the factories, nearly all factories in the nation, had been converted into war factories to build munitions, airplanes, other vehicles that would be used to aid in the war effort. So of course, as you can imagine, this would be emotionally, mentally taxing, and it would have an impact on someone who was living in this culture and was being constantly exposed to all of the events that were occurring. So it makes sense. I think it's reasonable that someone would want to break, that they would value their time apart from the society, with such a great emphasis placed on the act of warfare. And then we get to what we can actually learn from these letters. And I think that they're really lessons in humanity. They're not really just relics from some bygone era. In terms of the greater scope of history, these may have well been written yesterday. And what we can learn from Dick is that one of the most, we can see in him exemplified one of the most pure and intrinsic human desires, which is just powerfully expressing the regard of love and friendship to another person. And that's what we can learn from Dick.
Thanks, Zach. Now I'd like to introduce Jessica Graf and James Burke, who will similarly talk about their experience transcribing and working with these letters, both in terms of the content and the project in general. So Jessica, and then James.
Hi, everyone. This isn't my PowerPoint, but. Okay. So, my name is Jessica Graf, and I'm, like Dr. Keegan said, in his section. When I was first assigned this project, like most of my peers, I viewed it with trepidation and honestly a little bit of indifference. I was like, what does this project have to do with me? What will I, a college student, ignorant, and think I'm on top of the world, learn from a bunch of old letters? And I think a lot of times we tend to view our older generations, if, they can't work a computer, what are we going to learn from them? And I think the most wonderful thing and most beneficial thing about this project is every one of my peers, and myself included, learned something unique and interesting from our letters, and we really came to love the people we were learning about. So, I also put cheesy animations in. Sorry, guys. So my letter was from Bill to Evelyn, and one of the most interesting things about my letter was, just besides obviously the writing itself, was the seal on top of it. I had never really seen anything like that before. There it is. And the seal was designed in 1977 by Charles Thompson, with the stripes representing the 13 colonies and the blue representing how they were united under one body. And the federal seal has been used throughout generations in Civil War jackets, other paraphernalia, and it was really interesting to see that because it showed how he was working in the Army, and this was something obviously he was involved in as he was writing war letters. So some of the rhetoric that was in my letter personally was Bill really was very interested in Evelyn, and he spent most of the letter courting her, which I thought was really interesting. Some of the things he said was he would flip situations back on himself, and he was really worried because Evelyn hadn't written him back, and he was like, man, why won't Evelyn write to me? I just want to, date her, be her friend. Come on, guys. And he was like, what is wrong with me? Why aren't you writing to me? Is it my fault? And he flipped the situation back on himself, making it easier for Evelyn to be like, oh, sorry, I was busy, ? But really, she just didn't want to write to him. One of my favorite parts of this letter is he compliments her as saying that, am I good enough in your eyes? And in parentheses, he writes those lovely blue ones. And I think any girl having a letter written to them where they're complimenting their eyes, talking about how important they are, automatically feels smitten. And I definitely was smitten with Bill. I was like, why don't I have a soldier writing to me right now? So one of the avenues of inquiry that really inspired me in my letter was the inclusion of baseball. Bill was from New York, and he wrote a lot about how New York was important to him, and one of his favorite things to do while being back home was to see a Dodgers game, which I thought was really interesting, because during the war, a lot of the baseball season actually had to start late because a lot of morale was being questioned, and a lot of the men in baseball were drafted off to the war. The baseball season ended up opening 2 weeks late because the teams lost about 500 players in total, and some of them obviously not making it back. A lot of people were concerned, but ended up that baseball boosted the morale of most people, and when in a time of crisis and general, issues, everyone came to the games and was really excited to view baseball and have a good day when all of their other days were filled with such tragedy. So I explored the team of the Dodgers a lot more deeply in my letter, and as it turns out, the 40s were a great decade for them. Their manager, Leo DeRocher, joined and was hired on the team, And from there, they got their first league pennant in 1941, when they also played in that decade many World Series against the Yankees in 1941, 1947, and 1949. This was a really big deal, and they had never really been an upcoming team. And during this decade, under the managing of Leo DeRocher, they really came into becoming a really fantastic and recognized baseball team. I took these pictures from the Brooklyn Public Library, which I thought was really interesting since we're doing an archives project, so I used another archive. One of the greatest moments for the Dodgers was when they signed on Jackie Robinson, who was the first African-American player in the National Baseball League, and he was signed on by the Dodgers in 1947, and he was the first African-American in the Hall of Fame and also made Rookie of the Year. Another interesting thing, along with me studying baseball in that decade, was women in baseball. Oh, more pictures of Jackie Robinson. Was women in baseball. Before World War II, women had never really been allowed to be in sports, but seeing that all of the men were off to war, there was the very first All-American Girls Softball League was created. It was wildly popular, and tons of people came to the stands to watch women play ball. It included over 600 women, but after the war, due to financial issues, it had to be closed down. The league ran from 1943 to 1954 and was a great portion of American history that I don't think I would have looked into without the help of my letter. So another part of my letter that included the rhetoric that also made me more smitten with Bill, if I already wasn't in love with him, was he had this great description of the moon. He talked about dancing under the stars with Evelyn and how he would whisper sweet nothings into her ear. And obviously me reading this, I was like, oh my gosh. Why is he not writing this to me? What am I doing wrong? It was great. So obviously in my letter, I learned a lot and I explored a lot of avenues that I don't think I would have because of my letter. And I think this project is really great because of that. And I think the biggest thing I learned is that communication, old-fashioned communication, is really important. And the idea that every story is meant to be told, no matter how silly or even how insignificant at the time it seems, even if it's told by you or by a bunch of kids generations later. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Burke. Like Dr. Keegan said, I'm a student of his, and I'm going to talk about Clarence. This is actually, this is actually Evelyn's. It was her boyfriend before, prior to when he went into the war. So at first, when starting this project, I wasn't too excited about it either, along with a lot of my colleagues. I was just kind of like, I'm eavesdropping on this poor lady's life. I'm looking into, her past relationships, and I'm opening up things that probably shouldn't be brought up. But overall, after the math, it was a really cool experience, and it was just really cool getting to learn. Reading through this letter the first time I went through it. I had transcribed it all, and I was just like, okay, let's read it and see what there is. And I was just like, this is the most dead letter I've ever read. There's nothing exciting in here, what I'm going to talk about, but I already transcribed it. So definitely some conflict in that. But after a while, it just took a while. You just got to, and this isn't anything, there's, like Dr. Keegan always says, there's rhetoric in everything. So after reading it multiple times and, after just pulling certain things, it's actually really funny the amount of stuff that I found from Clarence since, as he went into the war, Clarence and Evelyn separated. So that made for a really interesting letter from Clarence. So I'm gonna probably focus more on the rhetorical analysis of this. So he was born in Carlisle, Iowa, and that's how they met because she was also born in Iowa. And then he was shipped, he had joined the 34th Infantry Division, also known as the Red Bull Infantry. And then my letter was January 12th, 1942, and actually 4 days prior, after doing some historical research. He was shipped from Camp Claiborne in Louisiana to Camp Dix in New Jersey, which is now known as Fort Dix. So just kind of validated the making sure that like it was actually a true letter at the right time. So all right. So okay. So my goal in this project was trying to find out where they actually stood. So one of the first things that I noticed in his letter was love Clarence, is how he ended his letter. And personally, when I'm writing to an ex-girlfriend, like over email or something, I don't think I would ever end something in love Jim, you know? So like, it was a little weird for me to read that because granted, it's like different times, but I don't think you end something with like, oh, you know, love Clarence, like, you know, hey, we kind of broke up. So like, it was difficult to, just seeing that, it was difficult to understand how, I mean, obviously we knew how Clarence felt, but we never really understood how Evelyn felt, and a lot of my colleagues also studied letters from Clarence. So we just saw this constant theme of him trying to get back at her, trying to make things up, and maybe reconnect after the war once he was back. And we're not really sure on how she stands. So there's also other parts where he says, I don't know how often I'll get to write to you, but I'll always be thinking of you. You know, cute little hints dropped, you know, trying to, you know, reconnect things, make sure things are still going on. Like, hey, you don't have another boyfriend at home, you know, so I'll be thinking of you though. So he also drops a little hint at the end, and he talks about, you know, and like you just wouldn't notice it at first. Like I talked about, you know, at first this letter seems really boring and you're like, oh, there's nothing here. But he talks about like, oh, you should come join me. Like I'm gonna go on some great adventure. I've only seen 22 of the 50 states. Or he says 48, so this is a little, so he said, you know, so I've only seen 22 of the 48 states, even though there's 2 more to come. But he's like, you should come with me and we're gonna go on some great adventure, you know, continually putting shameless plugs in, trying to make sure that their relationship was still there. So, also he talks about, so one thing that I really stood out to me in the letter, and I didn't notice this until maybe like a few days before the project was due. There's a quote in there, and it says, "You've been hearing from me pretty often lately, but they keep changing my address, and so I keep writing and letting everyone know my new one." At first, this doesn't seem like there's anything there, but when you actually think about it, who is everyone is the question. And you're, like when he's writing this, if he's trying to write and let everybody know, this is 4 days after he was shipped from Louisiana to New Jersey, and it talks about how he made multiple stops. So this was probably one of the first things that he was able to do at Fort Dix. And so it just kind of surprised me that, you know, oh, I have to tell everyone, all my friends, you know. So are you literally writing, you know, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, you know, like how many letters does he have the time for to write in his day? So that kind of surprised me. And that's what made me realize, like, oh, he's, you know, like, Evelyn doesn't really notice that, you know, she might just think, like, oh, you know, he's just trying to write to everyone, let everybody know, like, my new address, I got moved, you know, but he's like, oh, I only wrote, like, a letter to her and maybe to my parents. So he's kind of being clever and saying, you know, like, really trying to stay connected with her through the whole war, maybe to rekindle their relationship after. So, we're gonna, all right. And so, yeah, after the, again, why did Clarence write this letter? Probably to rekindle his relationship. You know, obviously he's still holding on to Evelyn and what he hopes that there's still a relationship there. And, you know, like, as anyone, his infantry, the 34th Infantry, after researching this, they were the first, like, ready infantry, like the war-ready infantry that was sent after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Because, like I said, my letter was January 12th, 1942. So this was only, you know, less than, you know, just about over a month, less than a month that, like, his infantry was already being sent and trained in camps. He was already in Louisiana, and now he's being moved to Fort Dix. So, you know, obviously, mail is a great thing. As all of us college students know, we love getting mail from our parents. Granted, we're not fighting for our country, but, you know, these soldiers obviously love the mail as well, and who better to write to than somebody that you're still madly in love with. So, but yeah, just this project was really cool, and just trying to find out, you know, that there's so much more to every single thing that we read. You know, we just don't pay attention to it. There's so much that we go through on the internet, and this is, you know, like, like what a better thing to read through than, you know, some old love letter, hidden love letters, you know, that we, you know, like we just don't get to experience all these different old artifacts that, I mean, you know, granted these are only like 60 years ago, but they're still, you know, historical artifacts that we can pay attention to. And you know, you might feel like you're eavesdropping on somebody's personal life, but, you know, as Evelyn talked about when she left her statement, you know, she was obviously really cool about, you know, hearing what we had to say as we analyzed all her letters and stuff. So I really appreciate that because I didn't want her to feel embarrassed that we were delving into her life. So I'm so grateful for such an awesome experience. And in the end, it was a great project. So thank you.
So the panelists, the students, Tom and I and Karen will all come up and answer any questions that you have. If you would, please step to the microphone to pose your questions. And I will remind my students and Tom's students that this is your last opportunity to really earn that participation score, all right?
Excellent point.
I will just start by saying,
Yeah, I figured.
okay, that Evelyn did say Clarence was very persistent.
She was very gracious. She shared some time with our class, so we had a full conversation with her, and students learned an awful lot from that. And she was so happy that that we were looking at these correspondences.
Yeah, please. Looking at that map that you had of the Women's Archives, are those just University of Iowa students who went abroad, or were those foreigners who came to the university?
Actually, it's not primarily University of Iowa students, because we collect anything about Iowa women, not just Iowa students. And so some could have been Iowa students who went on to become missionaries, or they could have been people who traveled abroad. There are some collections, I believe, of people from other countries who came to Iowa.
Are any of the German or Russian ones? If you guys need any help transcribing those, I could help you guys with that. But
Well, that's great, because there's actually, we do have some letters in German.
oh yeah.
Yes, and we would love to have you come in.
We'll talk after the show.
Good,
So.
excellent.
All right, I guess this is for the professors, kind of like swing of things, but with, I guess, both classes kind of doing the same thing, is there anything that you would have changed, if you could have, that you kind of plan on for next semester that we didn't do?
I don't know. I mean, that's certainly one of the things we often think about when we do new assignments like this. I mean, for us, one of the learning process is not one in which we design a perfect assignment and we hand it to students and say, this works, just do it, and trust us. I think one of the things I repeatedly ask my students is, as you work through it, if there's a better way, if there's a better format, as Matt talked about, if there's a problem you encounter and someone's got a better solution, whether that's a different kind of software or whatever, bring it to us. And so, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know that there are, I mean, there's minor things like, okay, if you're talking about a workflow, you know, maybe the software is not the best software. But in terms of the structural components, the rhetorical analysis, the historical analysis, the screencast, the live presentation, I mean, I was really pleased with the way that worked out. I think one of the objectives, one of the major objectives for me, in addition to getting students to do research, was getting them as rhetoric students to understand that whatever you've got to say, there are a number of different ways in which to say it. And so doing a blog post, doing a screencast, and live presenting are all very different. And, you know, in reflections from students, as I'm sure you probably know, everyone hates a different part of the assignment. You know, the screencast is really difficult, or I hate public speaking, or the blog post was boring. But I think, although I don't think many people said that, but I mean, that idea holds. So no, there's nothing, I have nothing, I don't know, what do you think? Is there something that you would rather do or alter?
I think that, as Tom suggests, the technology sometimes comes out front, and that's what people see and understand about the assignment first. So to take a step back from that would be a better way to frame the assignment for students in many respects, so that they don't worry about the screencast first and foremost, and instead examine the letter. And that will inform my approach to, you know, my second semester with the project.
I mean, I think that's a great point, because I think, and this is a big deal with the digital book. It's called the Digital Humanities, right? This decade, and next decade will simply be the humanities. But one of the problems with with what we call digital humanities is we tend to focus on the technology. The technology is fluid, you know. The phone was a revolution. The rotary phone was a revolution. My students don't, you know, they know what it is, but, you know, it's like a hipster paperweight is what I tell them, you know. And so the technology is fluid, but the drive, the skill set, the analytical skill set, what research is, doesn't necessarily change. How we do it, the tools we use may change. And so Matt's right. When technology gets out in front of an assignment, that's a wrong impulse. You should never design an assignment in which, you know, the goal is we got to use this toy. The toy is always in service to the objective, and the objective is to, you know, to learn and to decide what good inquiry is and how to be persuasive and how to convey your message.
And that said, I think I was so impressed by all of my students'
Right.
ability to see beyond the technology and do exactly that. Engage with these letters in a really meaningful way.
And I would just add that it's great from the library's perspective to see different people, like rhetoric students are not usually the ones who come to the Iowa Women's Archives, but the technology in terms of the digital library allowed them to use it in a way that was maybe a little bit less intimidating, and also maybe opened some of their eyes to the fact that history can be sort of interesting.
Can I ask for a quick show of hands, how many of our students in the room actually went upstairs to the physical archives? It's more than half a dozen. I'm looking at probably 8 or 10, and that, I think that's pretty unique.
And Evelyn's scrapbook is over there, by the way, for those of you who didn't get a chance to go and see.
This assignment was really focused on one person's letters and a few letters, a few people sending them.
Yeah.
So the class really had a lot of feedback on each other's. How different would it have been? What would the benefits or challenges have been if the letters had been less focused? Maybe World War II in general, or just even letters?
Sure. I mean, that I alluded to, that's a great question, thank you. I mean, I alluded to that in my opening remarks. The first time we ran this project for the first time last semester, and we piloted it with one section, an honors section I was teaching at the time. And our go-to, Jen Wolf had said, okay, I've got this cache of letters. It's from the Pioneer Lives collection. And so we had, I mean, I don't think there were any repeat letter writers, maybe one or two, but there's so many more that it just wasn't the case that we had overlap in terms of who the authors were, or the focus. And because that was the first time I had done it, I thought this is great, this is ideal, right? That you've got, one student was transcribing a poem, other students were talking about, one was some bills from a law agency. They had all kinds of things from different businesses and individuals, children, adults. And so that was really wonderful. The breadth was really interesting. And so but they give you different things, right? So one of the most difficult things I think for students to do when the letter has no ostensible historical event, when it's like, hey, how you doing? I miss you, blah, 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 but there's nothing there. We say, okay, well, at the very least, you know when it was written, if it's dated. And so what was going on in the world that day? And that, even if it seems remedial or irrelevant, the juxtaposition of the local to the global, what's going on in a totally another part of the world while this person is writing this letter. So when you don't have this kind of data set of 6 writers, you get a very broad, I think, a broad spectrum of what's going on, because they're all from the same era. So they worked really well. I mean, the thing I didn't anticipate, and I said one of the things I was nervous about when Jen said, okay, let's use these 6 guys, basically, was, oh man, you know, it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same letter over and over again. But as Jim pointed out, a bunch of people had Clarence, you know, and each letter is not identical. And that there are different concerns and tonal. It'd be like saying you don't get bored with your friend day to day, right? Each day is kind of different, and they have different tones and different messages. And so that layering process is really great. And so I think it's, you know, the Pioneer Lives thing was really diffuse, and the World War II scrapbook was pretty deep and layered. And I think both have merits.
And the other thing is that different people bring things to the letters. Like the baseball and whatever, you know. So that's another aspect of it.
So to the students, because these letters were handwritten and not typewritten, do you think the fact that they were handwritten affected your analysis of them? I know one of you said that it was a little hard to decipher the handwriting, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I'd say it had a very minor impact, if it had any impact in any way. And part of that is because we were able to transcribe that, and so the meaning was still fully coherent. The same meaning was transferred over in the words.
So I just felt that there was a lot of phrasing that just was difficult to decipher. Like I know some student in our class had this phrase, University of Life, I think it was, and we searched, probably like an entire class period looking for University of Life, and there's nothing. And just the use of grammar was a little sketchy in some letters. You had orders as order, like just grammatical errors that made it difficult to truly understand what they were saying. And, just the cursive used, it was always difficult to decipher letters. But as a class, we worked really well together of, using the tile classrooms and everybody working together to try and work out some of the words. So.
I honestly think it was more beneficial that it was handwritten. Just the significance of having a handwritten letter and being able to see that someone took the time to write out these words and these feelings and how they felt about someone, I think, in a way made the letter more significant and made me more interested in finding out what this person had to write about. Because if they took time to write about how their day was, when I write letters to my family back home, I feel like that writing is more significant just because I wrote it down instead of quickly sending them a text being like, thanks, BRB, smiley face.
I just had a comment about this. When I was doing mine, I was having a really hard time with this one sentence. And I was actually saying, sorry for my poor handwriting. And I just got a kick out of that because I was like, what is this saying? And Alec was telling me, I'm like, he's talking about his own handwriting. So it was hard that way, but it was funny.
What a fascinating project. Thank you so much for bringing it and sharing it. And I was going to ask, will you now all write letters by hand to people?
Okay. Well, I've written hand letters my whole life. I'm an English major, so
Good for you.
That's all. That's all I do. So also my parents send me money if I write them letters.
Right? Well, we worry in the world of the library what will happen to correspondence because people aren't saving their smiley face,
Yeah,
all those things, and so they're really, really important. So I think just your exposure to this and the fact that you took the local, which is what we're celebrating this month, and which is a marvelous thing. And Evelyn was a lot like Irving Weber in the fact that she wrote for a newspaper, and so that the synergy with these two projects, the Irving Weber days and your project, is just marvelous. But things get lost when they get digitized, and so saving them in this fashion is wonderful. So thank you again.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I should point out, Evelyn still writes for the newspaper and still does a radio broadcast on a semi-regular basis, and she will be writing and talking about this project.
And we can send a copy of this to her, so
Oh, yeah.
I think she would like that as well.
I'm sure she will. Hi, Evelyn.
I
had a question for the students about your research process. If you could just, speak about, anything you learned that was interesting about the process itself. Maybe you went somewhere interesting or had some hurdles. Like
I think the best part about my letter too as well, I talked about how a lot of my peers analyzed letters from Clarence, and that actually really helped me because it was easier to verify and check facts, like historical facts, with my other peers with their work. So reading through their letters after they had transcribed them, because as soon as you had transcribed them, you put them in the DIY history page, and so then you could look at that, and then you could easily read like, oh, well, he was here at this time, so then he was here at this. It was easier to plan out and actually verify what he was saying with like the facts that we had studied from World War II. So it actually really helped that other students were working on the same letter, not the same letters, but the letters from the same people, so that we could just verify facts.
I think one of the most interesting parts of my research process was, like I mentioned earlier, is I got to go through the Brooklyn Library archives, which I thought was really interesting because I really wasn't the type of person who was like, let's go archive. And so it was really, and so it was really beneficial that when I found all those pictures that they were right there and also were digitized. So I really think it's beneficial now knowing that all these libraries out there and all these universities have these online archives, because I wouldn't have been able to access all these direct pictures from baseball in the 1940s.
There were a few references in the letter. For example, Dick talks about seeing a play called Brother Rat. I was able to look up that play and read the plot synopsis of a play that was written and acted out in 1943, which was very cool. But the most fascinating part was probably speaking to Evelyn herself on the phone, because in a project like this with letters written 70 or so years ago, can't do the math so quickly in my head. We're definitely expected to assume based on the context and to postulate, but we were actually able to speak to Evelyn, who is 94, and she was able to recall everything with more clarity than I probably would have been able to for things that happened a year ago, so that was an amazing experience.
Contacting Evelyn was the idea of our students too. So Alec Oslin was talking in his group, and they came across her website and found a Contact Evelyn button. So they started contacting Evelyn. So,
I have to say, in many ways, the collaborative impulse that Jim refers to, in which really is the DIY history project that the University of Iowa Libraries put on, whereby they crowdsource the task, where you have all these digitized manuscripts, they need to be transcribed. So it's a collective effort. And in the classroom, and particularly there was a question about handwriting, that I can't tell you how many times, both last semester and this semester, that someone would say, is this an S? Is this an F? And so we blow it up. We have, we work in these tile classrooms that are, these really teched out classrooms with screens, and we're able to put things up and zoom in and spend a lot of time. You have, 18, 19 pairs of eyes looking at the letter. We tend to kind of get closer to a suitable answer. And so that, I think that, to me, it's minor, but to me that was a great moment for, collaboration, and also how fine the grain can be of research. Like, particularly with the Pioneer Lives collection, those 19th century letters, we talk about like spelling mistakes are one thing, but different spellings and not just grammar errors, but just a different lexicon being employed, different colloquialisms, is a wonderful invitation to kind of study and understand. And as rhetoricians, we're like, how is language deployed? How does language change over time? What do its uses look like? It was just a wonderful part of the project.
All right, so this is a question posed more towards the students. Is there any aspect of this project you wish would have been different so as to make it more beneficial to you?
Go on. Hey, this is the last day of class. Like, it's like,
Oh, are you ready for that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I felt one part that I had the most trouble with was the screencast at the end. And I know we talked about this. It was just more technological problems. But I just kind of felt like it was very repetitious that we were doing a screencast of something that we had just presented for our class. So that was, if that was done differently, or, if that was, like a trailer to our presentation, if it was used differently, I think that would have been a cooler part of the project. But I think that was probably the most just like kind of unnecessary part that we did.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that I felt like I kept repeating myself over and over again. Then in the blog post, in the presentation, in the screencast, and I was like, how many times do I have to talk about how awesome Bill is? Oh my gosh. And I definitely think, in a way, if maybe we had filmed our presentations, or had it been a little bit easier where we just didn't have to do it one more time, like just a screencast in the presentation or just the blog post in the screencast. I feel like after the third presentation, I was like, I like Bill, like I really do.
Yeah, I felt the same as they did. I felt things began to become a bit more monotonous after interpreting the same information with 3 different platforms in a way that was very similar.
I don't know, we have some left. Anyone want to defend our approach, or no?
I will point out that Zach emailed me this morning and said he will remember this presentation when he's 65 years old. So that is one advantage to doing it 3 times, and now 4.
Yeah, it's definitely ingrained.
Right, I mean, for all the times you got sick of it, you're still here.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, I didn't ask you, I didn't tell you.
Well, I volunteered so you stop talking.
And I lost a coin toss. Not actually.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I was hoping to hear from Zach and Dr. Keegan's 2 students to perhaps hear a general reflection, both on this project and their experience in the course as a whole.
I personally loved this this class especially. Definitely has helped me consider pursuing a rhetoric minor that Dr. Keegan makes shameless plugs for in our class, but definitely worth it. It's an like we talked about earlier, the tile classrooms are set up so well, and it's just a great place to be learning because there's so many different things that you can be doing in the class. You know, there's the computers in the, you know, and we were fortunate enough to be working in that classroom, and that especially helped us in our project because there's laptops at the tables that we're working at, you know, and as well as working with our table mates, we're working with our entire class and having Dr. Keegan right in the middle, so he was easily accessible, and, you know, we're able to put our work up on certain screens, you know, so that Dr. Keegan can help us on this screen while, you know, the other students might just be working on a different screen. Like there were so many benefits to working in a tile classroom, and I mean, Dr. Keegan's a great professor, so it was just really cool to be able to do all this stuff. Hey. No, but yeah, it was an awesome experience, and I'm so glad that I took this course. So.
Yeah. As much as I complain about this class and Dr. Keegan in general, I'm now an engaged social innovation major, so I'm kind of doomed. But I definitely would say that the tile classrooms really foster such a community atmosphere and such a general sense of learning and enjoyment, and I think I made a lot of really good friends in my class. And I think this project in general was a really good way for us to look back on a time period that we normally wouldn't have been interested in any way, shape, or form. And I think in a way it kind of forced us to reflect on our past and reflect on generations behind us and how significant every moment is in time.
This was very cool for me because I feel like most of us have had past experiences in dry classroom settings where we're almost expected to recite history in a very bland and even lifeless way. But here we were actually able to contextualize that history in a very personal way. We were able to see it from the perspective of people. That definitely gives history a more human aspect. It definitely contributes to our greater understanding of it. And I also feel like this entire project was consistent with the themes that we had been looking at later in the class. Like we just read the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and one of the major themes of that book was talked about in one of the quotes saying that we shouldn't see anybody as abstractions. Each person is their own universe with their own mysteries and their own subtle nuances of character. And this definitely helped to reinforce that and recognizing that each person, by virtue of being able to spontaneously generate their own feelings and emotions, have value. And there's nothing that can really be dismissed as completely valueless.
This is for the professors. Ever since we've been using the Burke B scrapbook, do you guys plan on using a different scrapbook for the next semester, or are there other collections that have come up that have interested you?
Well, may dismay Karen to know that next semester we're going to have probably 12 or 14 rhetoric sections plus some classes from arts looking at archives. And that will be in collaboration with Hancher's artist in residence. They're bringing Liz Lerman to campus, and she's a choreographer and performance artist. And she talks about alternative research methods. So we'll be looking more at actually World War II and World War I correspondence and other documents because Liz Lerman's current project is about America's wars, starting with the Civil War and how we understand that as a society, and pushing forward to help us better understand our present day wars. So students next semester won't be working within Evelyn's scrapbook because you guys so well transcribed the whole thing. But they'll be working with many other thousands of documents that the Women's Archives, the Iowa Archives in the libraries, and DIY Histories has available.
As you're choosing those documents, one of the things that was really cool about doing this, and Zach talked about it, was being able to talk to Evelyn. So are you going to kind of keep in mind that aspect when you're choosing? Because that worked out really well for us.
Well, in part, we got to Evelyn through Jen Wolfe, who identified the scrapbook as probably relevant to rhetoric students, because at the time Evelyn was corresponding with these gentlemen, she and they were about your age. So that made a lot of sense. We'll be looking for ways in which we can find similar, I don't know, intersections between student interest and the documents that exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to the extent that we're able to, sure. I mean, I think that, as you well know, I mean, it's nice to work within the text itself, but then to meet, as I think you guys talked about, to confirm some of your suspicions with the person associated with the work is important. Now, can we do that? That's probably not going to happen with Civil War letters, you know.
Not even with World War I letters.
I think, and we do. I mean, and Matt mentioned Jen Wolfe. I mean, Jen Wolfe and Kelly McElroy are, and they're sitting in the back, like, you know, very modestly observing, are like spelunkers for us. You know, they're down there in the DIY archives looking at, you know, things that they think you guys will find interesting and that will work. And so, I mean, we lucked out because Jen put in so much hard work. I mean, we're just here designing the assignments. Jen brings us, you know, the raw material in Kelly because they, you know, are dedicated to making your experience, the student experience, interesting and rewarding. And so, yeah, whenever we can connect students with the letter writers, absolutely, that's something we'll pursue.
And we're sitting out front here, but really this whole project belongs to Jen and Kelly. They were the. They inspired it, and they came to us and said, hey, we want to teach DIY history. And we said, well, okay, we'll help. So we got on board, but it was them who had the idea.
Okay, I know it's been mentioned on numerous occasions the collaborative nature of this assignment particularly. I was just wondering, and I know lots of people benefited lots of different ways from a teaching standpoint, from a learning standpoint. I was curious from the perspective of the Women's Archives, what did the archives gain in particular from the rhetoric students doing this project?
Well, one thing we gained is the transcribed scrapbook. But the other thing we gained is that we had all of you looking at this in a much more intense way than would normally be done. And I think because there are so many of you looking at it, that brings so much more to the project than if one person were doing it. The other thing is that we got a chance to hear some of what you had to say, and that helps us understand the material in a better way and helps us think about our other collections too, but especially the Burke papers. So I love it, and as I said before, I also love the idea that it's students outside history using these materials, realizing that they're rich materials for all sorts of reasons and purposes.
Well, this is a great discussion.
Yeah,
I think
thank you so much for
we've
your
gone
questions.
15 minutes over time, but if anyone else has a final question, or we'll just say thanks to the Iowa City Public Library for hosting this event, and to the Iowa Women's Archives and all of the wonderful librarians at the University of Iowa Libraries.
And our students.
And thanks to all of you for
Thanks very
coming.
much. Thank you.